You go.
There you go.
All right. I shared on this one here. Okay. Here we go. Yes. Boom, boom, boom.
There we go.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone this week? I kind of gave my football time in Boston update. How are you all?
Doing pretty well.
Yeah, I'm good. Did you guys meet yesterday?
No.
Yeah, we
I, this, I just was gonna do work on stuff, and I kind of did, and I kind of didn't. So that's okay. Get this set up here. So I know last time, um, thank you. I think you set all this up, Amanda. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
We got to like page 114. Yeah, that's right.
yeah,
But I
we
wouldn't mind.
just started
Yeah.
chapter 7.
Yeah. Okay. This chapter 7 is kind of interesting. It feels. I'm really curious how this chapter is different from the other one because I know Norbert kind of like he speaks pretty plainly, but he also I'm curious how much he originally wanted to say about something. Obviously, he says, he doesn't like how things are looking, but I'm curious about that. Anything we want to say in the welcoming parts, like from last time or the future, or is this still a good time to meet? I know you might want to change the time for the other meeting. Maybe after this book, if you want to shift it to Thursdays, or how we're feeling about all that stuff.
Yeah, this still works for me. There's
Okay.
no rush with that.
Okay. Cool. We're getting there. My only update is I found I think I put it here actually. Just for preview for later. It'll be interesting. I'm going to have a interesting discussion to have about the expert writing discussion, also Overton Window and Zeitgeist, also Foucault. And I'm curious about your takes on that person, if you're familiar with him, Amanda, and something I'm doing with frontier mapping and kind of this bit about Norbert and Shakespeare and sort of that will be kind of an interesting discussion. That's sort of a preview for me about that. I've gotten someone recommended some different books to me. One about that philosopher. I did find a great book called When Maps Become the World, which is about this guy whose experience as a cartographer, but also is interested in the philosophy of science, and it feels super relevant. Like I kind of want to talk to him and say, hey, he wrote like 2020, I think. I want to reach out to him and talk to him about like I don't think it's kind of one of those things where I don't like he's not going to want to take frontier map away from me kind of thing, but more like, yeah, I'm actually interested in maps and the concepts he's talking about maps and how they'd apply to like philosophy and science and the development of trajectories. But I happened to find this book by Rasmus Gronfeldt Winther, When Maps Become the World, in the public library here. And I think it'll be quite relevant to frontier map and to kind of some of the things that I'm mentioning down here too. So that was exciting fun this weekend. And I've also looked a bit at like Karl Popper and his stuff. And I found the Thomas Kuhn's actual text on scientific revolutions. And I feel like I'm understanding those things slowly. And they help a lot with the methods project in general too. We didn't really meet this week. I don't want to talk about it that much, but maybe Saturday I'll go into it a bit more if I'm not over my team's probable loss later tonight. By then, I might talk a bit more then about, did I think a very fair question, and I don't know if it was explicitly stated in the What Happened to Cognitive Science paper by Nunez that we talked about. Is cognitive science ever out of that first like proto-scientific phase or not? You could have a lot of arguments about yes or no. but I think it's a fun lens to think about. Are there actually accepted paradigms enough in quote unquote the cognitive sciences or science project that there could be normal science and then revolutions and changing paradigms and resetting and the whole cycle? Like, did it ever get to that phase, and why or why not? I think that's a very fair critique and lens to use for it, and kind of as a backdrop to the methods project in general along those lines. And there's also other lenses I want to use too about these things, but like I feel like I need to know who Karl Popper is. I need to know what Kuhn is saying about that, and that will frame some of the specifics, the big backdrop, and then some of the specifics we're trying to push forward with the methods project itself. I think that's a really nice, convenient way to encapsulate stuff with terminology other people have made. So kind of ground us a bit more that way. So I guess I'll stuff like that. We robot, just to mention this. I will be kind of focusing a little bit more on their frontier map stuff as that picks up ahead of time for me. So I might prioritize the We Robot and frontier map stuff a little bit ahead of the ISPSM work, but I am working on that too. They're related, but they're different events. A bunch of like grad schools supposedly starting up soon for me. I'm waiting on the specific confirmation, which is a little bit annoying. And that's it. That's probably plenty enough. We can dive into this chapter. That's 10 minutes away already. I know last time we were making our way through this. I think this is a useful way to frame the entire chapter, because I forget where this is. I think it's like one of the first few pages of this book. But this bit about the fate of information in and typically the American world is bought and sold. And I guess if you read the whole chapter, he concludes by saying this is, an inevitable spiral into basically being mercenaries, and whoever has the biggest bidder. A conscience bought once is a conscience bought twice. And these sort of kind of moral reprimands and warnings and admonishments about this stuff. And I think I'm curious if I don't think he really has a solution. Like, he kind of just says, hey, we better not do this. And like the closing line is something as like extreme as like, make sure you like put some people to death first, or something like it was like, before you go off doing this stuff. It felt like a really highbrow. I watched Jurassic Park recently again with someone who haven't seen it yet, and it felt like look. And also, as a side note, which I'll actually put here. As a side note, Jurassic Park, even though it was so tropey, and so not, the conversations were all like 2 or 3 sentences long. They weren't these deep monologues about anything. They're actually really good talking points for everything, like all of Ian Malcolm stuff and Nature Find a Way, and everybody says you could, but whether you could or whether or not you should stuff. But I find this chapter basically a version of a highbrow techie version of Jurassic Park, as a scary warning about things. Where were we here? Sorry. But last time we had bought and sold, and he's not saying if it's good or bad, but he's trying to point out the sort of inevitable nature of what happens as it's going down this path. And we talked about memes, speed of the internet, spreading without context, bits extracted, tension between the most portable and the most memeable and the most nuanced. And he goes into that. That's kind of this bit that I got here too. Like this part goes into that a bit more, which is interesting. Yeah, okay. I think that's kind of a recap. I see that you have some things here, Amanda, and I don't know if you want to just kind of, this is kind of about where we left off. This is it's not my business to cavil whether, etc. here. So 114, I think, is about where we were, but anyone have any thoughts before we dive into the text again, I guess?
So at the end of the last conversation, I definitely was, some stuff was unclear about like why he was talking about patents.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we moved on to talking about like how it's difficult to commodify information, information is not like a substance. Like that all made sense, but I still don't fully see the connection between patents and that point. So he says that like invention used to look like this, but now it looks like this. Jesse, I think you used the phrase like big invention or something to describe like the like research industrial complex maybe. So like he describes this change, and then he moves on to talk about information and why information is difficult to commodify. But I was wondering, I couldn't quite figure out what the difference between the present process of invention that's led by companies generally trying to make a profit. What's the difference between that and then the like patent process he describes as being like driven by the workers that are using the tools? Is it supposed to be a difference in terms of information? I wasn't sure. I don't know how much that matters, but that was my remaining question about patent law.
Yeah, I remember this coming up a little bit last time as well. My take on it basically is, I don't think I'm going to have a very satisfying answer beyond what we've already said. But my take on it is, now that I read the whole chapter, my sense of it is that Norbert's trying to kind of convey I think I mean, maybe I can reference this line and maybe this thing here where I think he's trying to show the disparity of how, like, just I do it's tough because I think Norbert is on one hand absolutely trying to do what he's saying here, and I'm pointing on the left. I think he is trying to do this, and by that I think he is trying to not take a moral attitude about this and trying to explain the mechanism. But I do think he's also inevitably trying to make a moral stance about it at the same time. And I think what he's saying and why he's using that example is that in the early days, the buying and the selling of information as a concept wouldn't have the same impact as because science was ahead of the workmen in that, meaning things could only be implemented to a certain degree by one person or one craftsman. And over time, as much as we're trying to use this sort of intellectual property or secrecy to constrain development, I think he's saying now the capacities of the workmen to implement science are very, very, very different. Maybe even like the mechanical competence at hand now in the industrial, militarized industrial complex, or the big research, big invention, big whatever, big pharma, etc. Now that the implementation scope is so bigger and more rapid, and that's obviously true, increasingly true today. And I think he's trying to. I think what he's getting at with that. I think what he's getting at with all of this is basically saying the implementation power of a bunch of scientists doing these sort of specific. He gives something here about like at the end. It was something like I'm trying to think what to search for. Whoops, it's not letting me do it. Nope, that was a bad choice. All right. This was a really interesting thing for New England because he wrote this in New England, and I live in New England now. That's kind of interesting. He talks about ciphers. I'm trying to find a specific passage that might help me try to finish what I'm trying to say with the other thing, though. There's something about big invention or big research or big, industrialized research, and there's a juxtaposition that's kind of unclearly made, in my opinion. Of he's saying when modern invention happened, the certain things are set because the mechanical craftsman was sort of the limiter on the situation, or that person could only output so much of something regardless of where the science was about it. And I think he's saying now we have these industrialized like CAFO big farms of people generating stuff, but there's a certain inability to keep a secret even if there's an immense pressure to do so, like the property and secrecy stuff. But I'm trying to find this specific thing. Some race is something along the lines of almost like here I think it is. There's a great fertilizing and revivifying value in the contact of two scientists with each other. This can only come when at least one of the human beings representing the science has penetrated far enough across the frontier map to be able to absorb the ideas of his neighbor into an or any, I don't recall what that actually says, effective plan of thinking. The natural vehicle for this type of organization is a plan in which the orbit of each scientist is assigned by the scope of interest rather than a predetermined beat. So there's something he's saying about the lone mechanical person who can pull things out, the way it's developed over time with these industrializations of it, and the kind of limited scope scientists are put in, like the silos, and saying, yes, it'd be great to have this stuff that's intermingled and cross-fertilizing. But he kind of says something here, like I'm really curious how this has changed from the first version, because it feels like he's dancing around some stuff here, right? Like at present they represent the result of efforts of a few disinterested men and not by those planned frame, which are being forced by those who imagine they know what's good for us. Like, what does that mean? Is that saying, is he saying the military industrial complex has taken over scientific research, and the security department and McCarthyism and who's the communist or not is distorting things so much that we're in this demand for secrecy, and since like these harsh words about sick civilization to learn the progress of its own disease. Like there's something here that I don't quite understand what his point is. But to kind of come back to your question, I think there's a general commentary about the industrialization of things has distorted the flow, like the actual. I think he's saying it's harder and harder and harder to see the actual consequences of things because there's so much more implementation and so much less actual talking between people. Something like that. And I feel like, let me read what you wrote here. I think he's basically saying, oh, this commodification stuff and the fear and the war stuff is bad. And I don't really see him saying what to do about it. Just that,
I think we talked before about sort of like the speed of communication with respect to people's ability to prepare for it or to understand it. And I think that's what he's trying to get at here. We talked about,
and then,
yes, future shock, which is kind of about the same thing, maybe, where you have an idea that there's this, people aren't prepared for things, technological change and things like that. And he's talking about it more as information flow, which I take it to be networks or information networks.
I think that's exactly what this passage is about.
So this was before the internet, of course. So
right. And then like before deep learning and everything else, which is kind of interesting, which is apparently not.
Well, I think, you had precursors to the internet. You had like books, you had industry, like he's reaching back probably to the Industrial Revolution where you had trade networks, you had exchange of ideas, you had exchange of goods, you had sort of consolidation of different networks. If you hook into a global network versus being in a local network, you're getting the spread of information, the spread of goods faster. And this just continues with the internet. So, I mean, he's kind of putting together that historical arc. And
yes. And I'm kind of going to bridge what I have over here with where we are in the text, which is like 115, etc. He's kind of getting into this thing about Bell Labs and so on, and we talked. This is kind of where we left off last time. We talked about like as a commodity, gold holds a lot of value. Gold and these material things hold value much differently than information, which information cannot be conserved as easily, etc. Entropy. Information and just he's kind of pointing out, I think this whole chapter is kind of pointing out the folly of seeing information from a economic point of view, which again there's no alternative suggestion, but it's just like saying,
sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, I wish. Thank you. There's no real alternative from this, but it's kind of where he's at. I think I'm almost to the point I'm trying to get at here. Commodity talks about artworks here, and then we're kind of getting to physical position of art is kind of the long thing about artistry, which is a little. We're gonna say. Sorry.
Yeah, I liked the discussion of art, and I liked the analogy with war technology to explain how, and this was to explain ultimately how information, where its value comes from, and it comes from like context. Like you can't separate its value from its context because it's not like the gold is not a substance. And the context is like uncontrollable, unpredictable. So I thought talking about art and then talking about technology was, those are just great examples to explain the nature of the value of information.
Yeah, and I forget if he mentions Picasso here. I know he talks about like referencing Shakespeare, and I think Picasso's shortly after it or before it. Schoolboys and Shakespeare report. Yeah, okay. This is basically where I was leading us towards anyway. Here is basically, and anytime you want to reference this, the notes you have over here, just let me know. But to kind of continue from that, I guess this is from the standpoint of property, reproduction rights are covered by copyright law, but there are other rights no copyright law can cover, which almost equally rise the question of capacity of any man to own an artistic creation in an effective sense. Enter NFTs.
Oh yes.
And these digital things that don't exist, but you're selling the idea of possession. I wonder how Plato would feel about that. Oh yes, you bought the idea, or almost like, oh, to be really trippy, because I was talking about what are the I guess they're called indulgences, when the church sold indulgences, like I forget which church in Europe somewhere, the Catholic Church or something. It was like you could get buy throw some money and we'll forgive your sins and also some ancestor sins, and you're good to go. Like now you have a commemorative NFT. Like you have this NFT that represents buying it and just these meta layers of it. Anyway,
yeah, that's what I thought of when I thought of like you was talking about the value of art, and like, you have ugly apes, and they're sort of like, they're valuable. Why? Well, it's the stand-in. Like, it's just like art. Why is art so valuable? Because people like it. There's context. Sometimes it's also a money laundering vehicle, but that's much different than
which is actually a tremendous point to make it all of this.
Yeah.
Because yes,
context.
The means by which we're presented as, oh, this is valuable, this is something, but also like this is a way to filter the byproduct of the system into some more amenable, happier looking thing. And then you get people who benefit from the system to squabble over. So, oh yes, this thing is so much, and like that's a great point, and one to be expounded upon later. But so on 19 he goes and he gets to Shakespeare's down here, but before we get that, informative value of a painting or piece of literature cannot be judged without knowing what it contains, that it is easily not available to the public in contemporary works. Independent information. I keep hearing all this time. I keep hearing my famous quote, which you guys know it. I will say here: the transmission of information is impossible, save for as the transmission of alternatives. And I feel like it's the same thing here with this bit about the schoolboys, and this thing here, like it's what's the difference, or what is the signal to the noise? Like he's I think the interesting thing about this book is like he's putting a lot of his context, like these are cybernetical questions and information transmission and signal processing questions that come up in these other aspects of society. So I think it's an interesting book. You could look at the whole book through that lens, and I think that'd be probably one of the better, more interesting ones to look at everything. It's just from that like applied sense of I don't know, theory or ideas, as opposed to some of the content. But I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of his zeal is about trying to communicate that lens as being useful, and then like underappreciated or overlooked or unintelligible lens in some ways. This should be more thoughtful. It is only independent information, which is even approximately additive. And this goes directly to expert writing, when I was talking about that some time ago. And the guy, I forget his name again. I don't know if I can see it in my history. I don't think it's going to come up. No way. The dude was talking about expert writing. His point is exactly this. It's saying when you're writing deep in a field of study and you're an expert and you're communicating to an audience, what makes your writing good, or I would say valuable. which is a little honestly perturbing for me to say in the context. Like, it is spoken directly in the context of American bought and sold. It is speaking to the economic context. So I would say valuable in that sense. But to step away from that and just talk about what he was saying about expert writing, it's about how clearly you are making your point that the reader should change their mind about something, which is directly related to it's only this information that can be additive when you are doing a forward. And expert writers may be talking how to have success within that system, but at least it's sort of affirming or corroborating that notion. Derivative information is second rate, and you could say, well, hello, the chat GTP junk stuff that's coming out. So maybe he goes back to copywriting here. I forget that. There is no form of copyright law that prevents a movie's success from being followed by a stream of inferior picture exploiting the second and third layers of the public interest in the same emotional situation. Neither is there a way of copyrighting a new mathematical idea or new theories such as that in natural selection or anything except the identical reproduction of the same idea in the same words.
Yeah, that was interesting. I thought it was interesting also his description of like the secondary and tertiary forms of art, because I think that's what like 90% of art right now is. So that was a funny description.
Well, and not to be, I feel like this is a really convenient, nitpicky, like useless gadfly thing to say, but I'm going to say it in the sense that works for art, and also particularly within, yes, the cognitive science arena. Like, where is the robust ideas and integration? Like, where is it? It's not there. And I would say the conviction I have is less about if it can happen, and more after really studying this, the things that kind of would comprise the methods and the means to do it, which we're still young at and naive at. I would say what I can say with conviction is it's not there. Like, it just isn't. I said to someone literally earlier today, and I have a few minutes to say this, so I'll say it before we go on all this stuff, is I wish someone told me when I was in high school or when I was starting out my learning journey and the way that I have gone down, is that there are certain fields of study that are developed in a certain way, and we talk about them with this level of confidence or this level of, okay, we're here. But in reality, there's just stuff that doesn't exist. And it's sort of like an unknown, or I don't know if it's unknown or known unknown. But I think the reality is it's moving from an unknown to me to a known unknown. Like, we don't know that. It's less, oh, could this possibly exist? Which maybe it can't, but it certainly is it doesn't exist right now. And there's sort of a difference of that between knowing that it doesn't exist with some conviction versus feeling like, trying to traverse a bridge that has not yet been built. You're like, well, you can't walk 20 feet in that direction, like, because you're gonna die. You're gonna fall into peril. It's like, well, has the bridge been built yet? No. Okay, well, that changes the discussion quite a bit. Like, why can't we do that? Because it's not there. Whether or not, then that's a different question from, can the bridge be built there? That's a separate question, a very important separate question. But those discussions about those differences are not very, I feel like they were very not made clear to me for a long time. And I felt like all of the work with the cognition futures and the frontier map and my own personal quest have been sorting that out. And some of that's just not being, I didn't talk to, Margaret Bowden. Hey, Margaret Bowden, what's going on? Tell me about the history of cognitive science and fill me in. Like, I'm sure if I did that, it would have saved me a lot of time earlier in life. But at the same time, it's like, the way people have talked about some things, and also like to kind of go back to the book and the text here, what's really interesting about this point and the Shakespearean point and the Picasso point, and I've been thinking about the Picasso line ever since he said it, and saying how like Picasso ruined stuff, or Shakespeare. It's almost, and for those who are more familiar with sports, which I may not be everybody here, it's kind of like saying Michael Jordan ruined basketball, because everybody know, the whole planet knows who he is, and if you're not Michael Jordan, then who are you? You know, or if you're not as successful, or you can't do it that way, it's just this gravity around everything from the last 30 years of the sport is Michael Jordan. And there's great other players. There's LeBron. There's Steph Curry. There's all these people now that are great. But it's like that saying Michael Jordan ruined basketball, I think, is exactly the same as Shakespeare. Like, schoolboys do not like Shakespeare because it's just a bunch of things, and there's no rapport. And I think that ties into what he said about the scientists too, and like the communication about it. Or hear about Picasso with a painter like Picasso who runs through many periods and phases, ends up saying all those things which are on top of the tip of the tongue with age to say, and finally sterilize the originality of his contemporaries and juniors. And I think actually this page, this from top to bottom, is like my favorite part of the whole chapter, because it just provokes all of this stuff to me, and everything I just said, which I'm glad is hopefully being recorded. Like, that's, I think what would be really cool. I feel like the conversation Norbert's trying to have in this chapter about this stuff here, some of the context is a little wonky, and I think Norbert and everyone would commiserate, like, yep, it's the 70, 80 years since I've been thinking about this, and some of this stuff hasn't really, we're still dealing with it. But I feel like the conversation Norbert's trying to get at here is, I think if I was to try to offer so what do we do about it for this chapter, which Norbert doesn't try to do at all, and I don't blame him for that. What do we do about it is, like, we have to increase literacy and comprehension and understanding about it, which is the easy thing to say about everything. But like, how do we, I think there's a reason. I think it's important to draw the ties out between everything we're talking about here and what I said about why we don't have the models, why we don't have it. There's a relationship between the two things to me, and a relationship between technology. Like, we haven't had the technology either. And if you want to, I gotta remember my bridge analogy somehow. I'm gonna try to write that down for a second. If this is gonna let me do it, it's not letting me do anything. I don't know what's happening here. Well, let's do it this way. Just a second. Basically, I think there's something about all this, and can we build the bridge or not? And that being a separate question of if we walk where the bridge is supposed to go. Oh, it's up here. I'm in this. There we go. That's fine. I was searching for gibberish. I think there's something about all of this together. So yeah, and I see you're writing some stuff up here. Did you want to comment on any of that? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I also like the bit about Shakespeare and Picasso. So he's saying, like, he's kind of saying that, like, the value of art is a product of its context. When that art becomes a cliche, it's almost like it blends into the background. That's why the schoolboys don't like Shakespeare. It's like Maybe that's like my aversion to Kant too. Like for whatever reason, I feel like I've heard him referenced so many times that it's just like it feels like background noise. But the way he was discussing this sounds like the way he discussed like signal versus noise. Like disorder is common while order is rare. So similarly, unvaluable, like cheap art is everywhere, but good art will be rare, and it will make the bad art seem like noise.
Yes.
As a way of like describing the type of context that would make a piece of art valuable, it has to like stand out in this particular way.
So, yes, and I'm going to add into that with some time ago. I keep saying this point, and I need to write what it is when I mean this, because it's hard to carry the context. I said something about modern day Norbert Wiener would say X, Y, Z, and we talked a little bit in those times about the ability to see different embodiments, and kind of how technology affords the different embodiments or different situations. That was one part of it. I think another part of that would be what Norbert, I think, is not. I think what he's saying that he almost can't say in 1950, because it's. I think if he's here right now, he would say kind of what I'm going to say. I'm not trying to take credit for his ideas or say they're mine. I think he would say something like, the rate of change, there's an acceleration to this component. Like, it's not just Shakespeare anymore. It's, or Picasso, or Michael Jordan. It's the rapidity of things. And I think this is actually kind of maybe I would love to ask, hey, Norbert, is this what you meant about the workman stuff? Your original question, I think, maybe goes to this. He's saying the rate of change in and of itself, of things going through this process of becoming these almost like pixelated, or like becoming the tropes, and becoming so sterilized. I like how he says it here, becoming so the sterilizing effect, and then the inability to have the rapport of the context because of these things that are so enormous and so have such gravity or gravitas around them. The rate of change of that happening and things forming around them is accelerating, like exponentially. And you have this in different fields of study. Like you have it in, it's not even cybernetics anymore. It's systems neuroscience, it's dynamical systems theory, it's complexity. It's like you have these consolidations in the reference point, consolidation reference. And I feel like that is happening in terms of the dissemination of knowledge at breakneck speed, information deluge. But I feel like actually trying to diagnose that, I feel like Norbert would say, yeah, that's what I have been seeing. And his conclusion is this is not good. But I feel like there's something to be said to trying to illuminate that process to some extent, at least.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone's come up with a model for this, like back when memetics was big, and it kind of failed because they don't really talk about it anymore, and the journal memetics went away. Yeah, so I wonder how, if there like any people took Norbert Weiner's template for exploring the topic, or if it's like doesn't really incorporate much of that at all. The reason I'm curious is because it seems like one could put together a paper that kind of gets at some of these issues and then kind of recasts some of what was happening in memetics over the course of that fad. And that would be a nice, interesting paper. I think I'd learn a lot from that paper if it was done right.
Yeah, let's consider that.
I mean, I like the idea. You can see the idea of like feedback and derivative activity. Like if you have an idea and you feedback and you keep making copies of it that are slightly different, you get these derivatives, and those don't have as much value, but they're still like they could have some value. They're not entirely like clones. And then at the same time, you have this idea of consolidation and reference points. So you have this sort of feedback loop, and then you have maybe like another feedback loop that's a little bit different, where you have things coming into that point, and then there's a feedback to that point, which is sort of like the self-referencing aspect of context. So a lot of cultural landmarks have a context, you know what it is, and you have to refer back to that to get to get some value out of it. So it'd kind of be like, you'd have to quantify the information, but you'd also have to have a semantic aspect to the relationship where there's like this referential value.
There's a lot that could be said there, and we only have 10 more minutes. But I wanted to just ask this question: Is this a reasonable statement to make? In talking about history of cybernetics here, and John von Neumann, who I think looks like Bradley a little bit, a split from artificial intelligence. Like I know there's a split off, but does this cybernetics, such as the study of ANNs, were downplayed and the discipline shifted in the world of social sciences and therapy? Do you think that's a fair, like that happened, but
yeah, I think the sort of the derivatives, as it were, of cybernetics kind of went in different directions. So people used to talk about it in terms of like maybe artificial neural networks or some sort of representation like that, and then it became more popular to talk about it more figuratively in some of the social sciences, of course. And then I think the aspect of it that looks more like ANNs kind of went to control theory, and it got developed there separately. So people rarely talk about it in the way that we maybe talk about it, because they're not kind of combining the two anymore. They're kind of separate areas. They've been sealed off more or less. There's some exceptions to that. There is like some control theory in psychology, for example. I don't know how prevalent it is, but people have attempted to pick it up after the fact, and perceptual control theory is what I'm thinking of. But otherwise, they're not really in the mainstream.
Would you think this is a fair statement to make too? In the 1970s, new cyberneticians emerged in multiple fields, especially biology, and then we have our guys Venturana, Varela, and Altan. Who's Altan?
Oh yeah, that's definitely right. I think Varela was like explicitly inspired by second order cybernetics. Like autopoiesis is a fundamentally cybernetic thing.
It's so interesting because this page lays out history in an interesting way. UIUC.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's an interesting history of that group. So Hands-on Forrester had a lab at the University of Illinois. It was a biological computer lab, and it was around to like the mid 70s. And someone did a historical project where they kind of dug into the history of that. So I'll have to pull that up one day. We'll have to talk about it because it's really interesting.
If there's anything like next time I'm in Chicago, which I know that's not really the same.
They don't really have any. They don't have anything to commemorate it necessarily. It's like a plaque.
I know. I it's like the time I went to the MIT museum recently. They took down the big picture of Norbert Wiener, the one that was originally my lab picture. I was standing next to that picture of Norbert Wiener and like the black and white picture. So I gotta find these artifacts of the forgotten age. At any rate, we'll look at this later. I think we've hit a lot of the major points. I think it was interesting. It's very interesting. The analogies to weapons is quite interesting. Like weapons and stockpiles, and only having a more powerful weapon, and keeping weapons away from other people, he relates at some point, relates it to law and saying you got to jam signals and make your point, and getting to the place of you got to have the one guy who's no man, you're not lying. So I totally wrong. And also the thing where he says somewhere around here, it's like we have two goals. One's to make an indestructible box, and one's like to make this thing that can like dissolve everything. And just like, you know, I think that's sort of the crux of what it's getting at. Is like we're trying to do this stuff, and it's going to be this sort of paradoxical task in the way we're set up. Is this the end of it? No, not yet. He talks about the matter of time and ciphers. Yes.
Oh, he had a line that I liked that was, this greatest single example of the art of decoding is the decoding of the secrets of nature itself, and is the province of the scientist.
Yeah, that was like some serious swag, and like bringing it back to his like the different devils. Like I like how he tied in his devil talk. Like you could see him kind of like preaching, or like, you know, getting like waving his hands around, and however Norbert would do that. But he gets into it, you know. He's like, I could see he has like some swag about that. There's also a really good point here as I'm kind of breezing through this last part. Yes, absolutely, as you said there. Ciphers, and also, and he kind of blends that into how special it was to get these different, you know, countries' geniuses in one spot, and how much that's not going to happen. There's a very interesting point, actually, that I'm still trying to parse a little bit, where he says this thing about like the job part of it, paying a lot of money, basically making kind of mercenaries of them. But this bit here I didn't quite get. It was the skill by which the French and English do great amounts of work with apparatus which an American high school teacher would scorn in his thinking job is not to be found among any but a vanishingly small minority of our young men. The present vogue of the big laboratory is a new thing in science. There are those of us who wish to think it may never last to be an old thing, for when the scientific ideas of this generation are exhausted, or at least reveal vastly diminishing returns on their intellectual investment, I do not foresee that the next generation will be able to furnish the colossal ideas on which colossal projects naturally rest. That kind of is, I don't know how to interpret it. It's a little bit, I think haunting is a little too dramatic of a word, but I feel like, I think there's something there that I don't know what to really make of it. Because I'm very familiar. I really love Carl Sagan's quote about science and technology, that it will, you know, a society based on science and technology, but nobody understands it, or lost, and we're kind of, you know, grasping at these things we don't know how to understand. That's part of it. But I also feel like there's something to, I think there's something he's saying here that lends to what I was trying to say about the rapidity of the Picasso Shakespeare pixelation stuff, but also the lack of the colossal ideas on which colossal projects naturally rest. Like obviously there has been some colossal project like the Human Genome Project and these other things that exist. So I feel like there's some counterpoint, but I think there's also, there's something there that I don't know how to fully parse, but yeah. And then this bit about, then we're coming into the bit about scientists and being able to have communication with each other. This sort of dancing around talking about McCarthyism, perhaps, or state departments, or these governmental directives about secrecy or not sharing, or whatever. Weapons again.
Yeah, it was interesting that he started the chapter by saying, like, the way that we talk about information, or the way that he's going to talk about information for like the American audience, is like we want to fit it into this like substance that can be bought and sold. But I think of like maybe a deeper I don't know, metaphor for information would be this war talk. Information is something that can be like fought with and should be protected. Like that seems more fundamental than the buying and selling to me.
Yeah, and I think the kind of conclusion of his chapter is like taking that, like, okay, let's escalate that. He says it here: wars, science is impersonal, and results are the results of further pushing forward the frontiers of science are not merely to show us many weapons which may employ against possible enemies, but also the dangers of these weapons. And he has an interesting analogy of like the biggest way to keep the secret of if the bomb could happen will be to not do it. But now he said, well, we've demonstrated it can be done, and now anybody in a couple of years could make it them, like any group of people or country could do it, etc. And he gets very, you know, brimstone with there's no end to this vast apocalyptic spiral, which I put in the chat. Mercenary, etc. I think I'm trying to find the last page of it. We're almost there. Here's my thing I was trying to find too. We're in the position of a man who has two ambitions in life. One's a universal solvent which will dissolve any solid substance, and the other to invent a universal container which will hold the liquid. Whatever he does, he'll be frustrated. No secret will be safe when the protection of matter, human integrity, etc., etc. Yeah, so the effects of these weapons must be to increase the entropy of the planet, hack the planet, and all distinction of hot and cold, glue and bad, his sort of, you know, entropy wins cosmic thing. It's like so many swine who've taken into these devils of the age and compulsion of scientific warfare, rebellious pell-mell, head over heels into the ocean of our own destruction. The gentlemen that have made it their business to be our mentors, etc. Here, you're going to say something, or yeah. I did like his actual reference to psychology too, and sort of like all of these learnings we're using to kind of further this thing. He goes back into the demons and the devils, bedevilment, and stuff like that. And is it pretty? You know, it's not looking. The future's not looking so bright on his front. I have sympathy for his sort of concern and saying like, boy, the powers that be got to shift this course because there's no other way around it. I guess I feel like 70 years later, 80 years later, and being myself is like, well, you know, the track of things as it is kind of one direction. I think my hope is mostly just we have to build some viable things and some viable frameworks. I don't know if it's going to happen. That's like the only thing to do. I would say there's a little bit of there's an alternative to these two things, and you have to like build something else because that the system you can't build within the system. It's going to do what it's going to do. Anyway, that's my personal sentiment about it, and it's past 8 o'clock. Any concluding thoughts on this before? I don't know if we're going to get kicked out from the recording thing, but I guess we'll do chapter 8.
I enjoyed the chapter.
It was good. I appreciate the discussion a lot, and all like that ties into the other stuff. And I do want to follow up on this paper thing for sure. It sounds like maybe Rob Stone would be interested in that too. But
yeah.
I do want to kind of, after things settle and clearing the dust off of a lot of cybernetic stuff and the history of science things I'm looking at might be a nice way to go back into that vein of things because there's some things there to be mined. So, okay, that's all for me. I'll let everybody go and say it was good stuff. Thanks, Amanda, for kind of
That's the end of the book.